Okay, 5 o'clock. And first thing I'm going to start with, if you are not a presenter, please mute yourself. There's people who are, they're having conversations, they're on the phone. And the problem is I don't know all the presenters, so I don't want to go in and mute everybody and then really mess something up. So again, please mute yourself if you're not actually one of the presenters. My name is Jeff Gill. I'm the Executive Director. Thank you for attending today's program, Accessory Dwelling Units, a new approach to California's housing shortage.
On this ADA.
What?
I signed up for it.
Who is anybody
So
know who this person is?
Yeah, I'll help you out. There are three presenters. There's Minu, Ashabi, myself, Scott Porter, and John Willie Aglupos.
Great. That means I can go in and mute people as we continue to go through this. Thank you very much. So for attending this, you get one AIA learning unit. You can see our course number is provided there. Orange County is the provider. We will be recording the units for you. And it is not, there we go. I am required to read the description in learning units. That's an AIA requirement. Attendees will learn about accessory dwelling units and junior ADUs and the latest state laws that have streamlined the entitlement process, the general parameters that local jurisdictions have adopted, the requirements for homeowners, and the process to design for approval and construction. The learning units, attendees will understand state and local laws in terms of allowing ADUs and JADUs. Attendees will learn the steps and procedures to process design and development of ADUs and JADUs. Attendees will learn the role of the architects in terms of understanding the options available to homeowners, and attendees will review potential ways to expedite and develop prototype plans for ADU development. Now, at the end of this, you can see what you need to do. So you may want to take a screenshot or a photo on your phone, whatever is easiest for you, to receive AIA learning units and a certificate if requested. Please email Marilee Edgar. You can see her email is right there. And we need you to, unfortunately, include your name. Oops, lost it. AI member number, chapter, location, and would you like a certificate? Sorry, I had to bring it off, but all of everybody's photos was blocking the rest of this. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Minu Ashabi so that she can introduce herself and the other two presenters. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. My name is Minu Ashabi. I'm on the AIA board, and I'm also a principal planner with City of Costa Mesa. Willie, if you could start sharing your screen, that would be great. We have put together a very informative program for you this evening that should run about 40 minutes. And at the end, we have allocated about 15 minutes for a Q&A. You could also type your question at the chat box that we will read and try to respond to. Our first presenter is Scott Porter. Scott is a land use attorney with more than 20 years of experience, and he is with the law firms of Jones and Mayer. He has served as city attorney or planning commission counsel for several cities. He has particular expertise in the California Environmental Quality Act, land use development, and regulations of the wireless telecommunication facilities. He has drafted dozens of ADU ordinances and has regular conversation with the Department of Housing and Community Development at state level. And those conversations are related to housing legislation and regulations. Scott will be providing you with the information on the latest state legislation and the ADU by right standards and what local governments need to follow. Our second presenter is John Willie Aglupos. He's an assistant city planner with City of Costa Mesa. He has 8 years of planning in public and private sector. He has a master's degree in architecture and bachelor in planning. He's been a great asset to our team, and with his hybrid knowledge, he has been instrumental in development of several design guidelines and public handouts for the city. We have a short agenda for you this evening. We start with just the background regarding ADUs. Then we'll get into the legislation, the 18 housing bills that have been signed by the state and the 5 that are relative to ADU laws. And then we'll follow with what procedures would be best to follow if you have an ADU project. Next slide, Willie. If you, go to the next one. So first we start with covering why ADUs have become such a hot topic in the last few years. As many of you know, the housing shortage in populated states is really real, and especially in California, where the rental and the buyer market have soared in certain areas and hasn't even stopped during the pandemic. From local government standpoint, these are critical times, since providing affordable housing through policies have become more and more challenging. Also, local governments are required to complete their housing element update every 8 years, and this time around, the housing element is due in October of 2021. The housing element needs to include housing plans and policies that would address the existing and future needs of housing needs of each jurisdiction. Now, from homeowners' viewpoint, there are residents that see this as an opportunity for extra income and having an alternative living quarter for an extended family member. Next slide. So this slide shows the benefits and challenges associated with ADUs. As you can see, they can provide affordable housing units, they can offset a tight rental market, they could provide an asset for aging in place, they could encourage integration by providing affordable units in areas that are not so affordable, and they could also provide a discrete way of providing housing without fully changing a fabric of a neighborhood. On the other hand, some owners view this as having a negative impact on their neighborhood by increasing traffic, demand for parking, rental units, and shrinking the open space. So our role as government lies somewhere in the middle. We are trying to balance the pros and cons, and that's been the challenge. Now I'll pass it on to Scott.
So good late afternoon or good evening or whatever the time of the day it is. I'm Scott Porter, I'm an attorney. So my goal is to explain how these state laws work. And then later on we'll have Willie will end up talking about the architectural design elements that you might be considering. He's certainly got an architectural background, has his master's as an architect as well. So with that, I will talk about the rules, city's rules versus state overrides. So in 2019, starting in 2019, state laws started really ratcheting up the amount of regulation and the decreasing the authority of cities to regulate ADUs in the manner that they wanted. So essentially what they said is, all right, you cities, we were nice previously, but now we know the games that you guys play and you still are not allowing ADUs. We really, really want you to have ADUs allowed in your city. So then what they do is they say, no matter what, you need to, in these 4 situations, you have to approve an ADU, notwithstanding whatever other rules we would otherwise like to, you want to have. Now, cities can have their own sets of rules, but no matter what, they need to allow ADUs in these 4 different situations. So among those situations where the city may regulate is a city may regulate parking, and I'm quoting state law, parking, height, setback, lot coverage, landscape, architectural review, maximum size of a unit, standards that prevent adverse impacts on any real property that is listed in the California Register of Historic Resources. But then, like I said, there are a total of 4 overrides. 2 relate to properties that where there's a single family dwelling on the site, and 2 that relate to multifamily, if there's a multifamily dwelling on the site. So next slide. So there are 2 single family overrides. Notice I'm talking about what is on the lot. I am not talking about what the zoning is, which is different. So if it is in a residential or a mixed use zone, then these rules apply if there is an existing single family dwelling on the site. Now, these rules would not apply if, let's say, something is zoned commercial. Well, that's clearly, that is not okay. So you would not, this would not work if you have a single family dwelling in a commercial zone. So the rule is single family situation. So you've got a single family property. what they're allowed to do, first override, is you can have one accessory dwelling unit in an existing structure. So for example, if the city says, oh, all right, I would like to convert my attached garage into an accessory dwelling unit, the city will allow that. I want to convert a pool shed or some other existing structure or a portion of my house into an ADU. The city would allow that and must allow it, provided that essentially you're not expanding it by too much. There's an exception for 150 square feet, et cetera, but that's generally the rule. The other exception is for what the prototypical example is the backyard ADU. The external ADU that says that we must allow the ADU if it does not exceed 800 square feet, if it is no greater than 16 feet in height, and will comply with side and rear setbacks of no greater than 4 feet. Next slide. So the multifamily zone, if you have an existing multifamily structure on the lot, again, is it in a residential zone or a multifamily zone? If it is, then the city must allow the conversion of portions of the multifamily structure. So you have an existing apartment building. That is the multifamily structure. HCD has clearly stated the fact that you happen to have two, say, detached duplexes, in other words, two single-family dwellings on the same lot. That doesn't make it a multifamily structure. It's two single-family structures that happen to be on the same lot. Yes, you have multiple families living on the same lot, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, in your mind, think apartment building. So if you've got an apartment building on a lot that is residential or commercial, sorry, not commercial, mixed use or residential, then you can change the portions of that structure that are unused habitable space into ADUs. How many do you get? Well, you get at least one, or you get the greater of, so it's 1 or 25% of the number of existing dwelling units. So if you have 10 apartments, well, 25% of that is 2.5. You don't get 2.5 units, you get 2. So if you had 12 apartments, you could potentially get 3. The more common exception is the other exception, which is essentially you get 2 backyard ADUs, is what this is. 2 new construction ADUs that are detached from the apartment building that are no greater than 800 square feet, no greater than 16 feet in height, and comply with side and rear setbacks of 4 feet. And I think I've talked about that. All right, carry on. Next slide. All right, so cities, so those are the overrides. That says no matter what, we have to allow that. But cities are allowed to regulate. So for example, it's kind of this deal of the city will say, well, we want to allow ADUs greater than 800 square feet. So if we're going to do that, here's the deal. You have to comply with our code rather than the state code. And that's the deal that's been cut. So if state law does not preempt it, then the city can say whatever it wants. So what are the types of regulations that cities are allowed to have? So under the police power, the California Constitution, Article 11, Section 7 says the city can do whatever it wants unless state law says no. So and then state law has said no in some instances. So we have to allow ADUs in mixed-use zones. A city is allowed to regulate ADUs based on water adequacy, sewer adequacy, impacts on traffic, and impacts on public safety. And then also we must allow, cities, or when I say cities, I mean cities and I also mean counties. So if you are building in unincorporated county portion of the county, then it would be the county rather than the city is the one that you would be applying to. So when I say cities, what I really mean is municipalities, which is counties or cities. A JADU is a junior accessory dwelling unit, and a city must allow a JADU to be converted from existing space of a single family dwelling, not a multifamily dwelling, only a single family dwelling. Moreover, the JADU state law says that cities must allow them to be at least 500 square feet. Next slide. So we've talked about the setbacks. So the rule is that the general rule is if you are complying with the city's regulations, then again, you need to have setbacks that comply with side and rear setbacks of at least 4 feet, unless you're converting an existing structure that is already within those setbacks. So if that's the case, then you can simply comply with those new setbacks. I'm getting all these pop-ups. The chat messages drive me crazy. All right. If you have an existing, say, garage, and it's 2 feet away from the nearby property, you want to convert that, well, you don't have to rebuild the garage. You can simply convert that structure. Next slide. Single family square footage. All right, so this gets a little bit dicey. This is I should say, this is an extremely complicated law, and I don't think I'm hurting anybody's feelings in the state legislature if I say that this is very poorly worded. HCD agrees with me, every attorney I've ever spoken with agrees with me, every planner I've ever spoken with agrees with me, and every developer I've ever spoken with agrees with me. This is extremely complicated, and quite often there are provisions of state law that both simultaneously cannot be true. So you will be getting competing interpretations of what that law is. I am going to tell you what HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, says, which is different than how I advise my clients, which is different than what I might say in different situations. This is HCD's view of the world. So according to HCD is, well, first I'll talk about the state law minimums. That's uncontroversial. State law says that you need that all structures, regardless of whether it's an ADU, a house, whatever it is, no matter what, you need them to be at least 220 square feet to be able to comply with building standards. Now, a city normally has to jump through many legal hurdles if it wants to change state building standards. However, there's a special statute that says they don't need to jump through those special hurdles. Hoops. Rather, what they can do is they can automatically reduce the minimum size from 220 to 150. Some cities have done that. For example, the city of Costa Mesa has opted to allow that to occur. In other words, Costa Mesa is being nicer to the developer community than it is legally required to be. So as far as state law maximums, a city must, according to HCD, must allow, if it's a 0 to 1 bedroom unit, it has to allow the ADU to be 850 square feet. This is different than the 800 square feet that I was talking about before. This is if you are complying with the city's ordinances. The most that a city can require is 850 square feet. Meaning it couldn't say it must be 825 square feet or below. No, it must be at least 850. A city can always be more permissive. It can never be less permissive than state law requires. If it is 2 or more bedrooms, the city must allow the ADU to be at least 1,000 square feet. Now, the next provision is something where HCD and different attorneys have different interpretations about how this all works. Some cities believe, or at least have decided to, well, regardless, some cities will say, in addition, you're allowed to build larger than that. You get the greater of that number or 50% of the size of the existing single family dwelling structure. And then for detached ADUs, there is some language that in state law that talks about a 1,200 square foot minimum. And then there's other language that talks about 850 square feet or a 1,000 square foot minimum for detached. HCD says, well, it's actually the same. Regardless of whether it's attached or detached, it's at 850 or 1,000. Actually, as I'm saying that, I'm not certain that that's the case. I know it's 850, 1,000. I would have to confirm, but at any rate, it's easy enough to look up. HCD has a booklet available on their website. It was published in December 2020. Yes, December 2020. And if you go to hcd.ca.gov, you search for ADUs, you can very quickly find that. And if you really care what HCD's interpretation of that statute is, that's easy enough to find. I think I'm right, but don't hold me to that. And then, of course, a city must still allow at least 800 square feet, 16 feet tall, 4-foot side and rear setbacks. They said that twice because they hadn't told us once already. They need to tell us again. And then a JADU is a junior accessory dwelling unit. A city must allow it to be at least 500 square feet. It can be more permissive if it wants to, but it has to allow it to be up to 500 square feet. Next slide. Parking. So if this is a very interesting thing, this is one of those situations where the exception swallows the rule. In reality, 9 times out of 10, a city will not be allowed to require the provision of a parking space for an accessory dwelling unit. Okay, and I say this even though the general rule is that at least one parking space needs to be provided for the accessory dwelling unit. The reason, it's because there are so many exceptions. The most important, there are a few exceptions. One is if you are converting a garage into an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU, then you do not have to replace the parking that you lost from the garage. So you might lose 2 parking spaces. Moreover, you don't have to replace that, okay? Which is different than actually providing a space for the ADU itself. Yes, you lost 2, but you have to provide one for the ADU. And the answer is, as we said, the general rule is 1, but one major exception is if it's within half a mile of, quote, public transit, then you do not have to provide parking. Well, almost everything's within half a mile of public transit via walking. So 9 times out of 10, this exception will not apply. There are other minor exceptions, and you can look those up. Also, I should say there's one other exception that I will point out, is that ADUs that do not have a bedroom, in other words, a studio, you do not have to provide a parking space. Again, the exception swallows the rule. Impact fees. So a development impact fee, this is different than a processing fee. The city routinely says, will establish a fee that collects, and the city is not making money. Essentially, it's the city just recouping its cost. It cost us $2,000 to review your application because our staff time will take X number of hours, and we charge at $132.52 per hour, and you multiply that out by this, and we figured out that this is how much your fee is. That is a processing fee. That is different than what I'm talking about here, which is a development impact fee. A development impact fee is a fee, take for example, a park fee. That's a typical development impact fee. The idea is if you're building a new house, well, you are going to be increasing the number of people that are going to be using the nearby parks. So shouldn't you are creating an impact on the rest of the community, and we're going to need more parks as a result. So therefore, they do all this fancy math, and they come up with some number that says the amount of your park impact fee is X dollars. Let's say $10,000 for a new single family dwelling. That's kind of a typical number. It might be 10, it might be 15, it might be 7 or 8. Okay, well, cities were charging full impact fees for accessory dwelling units. And the state legislature said, no more, not on our watch. So they have limited the ability of cities to charge those fees. So instead of being charged, let's say $10,000 for easy math, they would say, number one is if the ADU is 750 square feet or less, then a city may not charge a development impact fee, a DIF, D-I-F, a DIF. If it is 750 square feet or more, then a maximum, that is not correct. It says maximum 25% of impact fees. That is incorrect. The test is that it needs, the fee needs to be proportional to, it cannot exceed the proportional share. So for example, if the single family dwelling is 10,000 square feet and you're building an ADU of 800 square feet, well, the 800 square feet is 40% of the size of the primary dwelling. So therefore, the amount of the fee would be no more than 40% that you could charge for the ADU. So instead of being charged $10,000 for your development impact fee, it would be 40% of that, or $4,000. Okay, so only if it's 750 and above would you be charged a fee. Moreover, if it's less than 750, there's no impact fees. Notice, I did not say that a city cannot charge for a JADU. A city may charge a JADU fee. a development impact fee. There's no limits on that. Some cities actually decide to waive that fee because JADUs are smaller than 750 square feet, but they're not required to. So, and then some cities choose to waive fees for the purpose of promoting ADU construction. All right, next slide. State law was recently revised in 2020, January, effective at the beginning of this year, actually, where previously it was a hand slap. We really encourage you cities to approve these applications within 60 days. And now it is changed to a city is required to approve applications within 60 days of receipt of a complete application. But that's the kicker. It needs to be a complete application. Of course, the city is going to approve something. If you've submitted a complete application that meets all those requirements, of course they're going to approve it. So it sounds like this is the best thing ever, but if you haven't submitted a complete application, they're going to deny it. So it doesn't really accomplish much. Processing fees still apply. Here's an important thing. ADUs are ministerial. So a city no longer can require a conditional use permit for those situations where it complies with specified standards. Now, there may be situations where they could require a conditional use permit or some other discretionary application if you go over and above the minimums of state law. But at minimum, they need to have some sort of a process that allows a ministerial process. So conditions of approval, the state limited ability of cities to establish certain types of conditions. For example, a city can no longer require the owner to live on site unless, unless this happens after January 1st, 2025. Thereafter, those regulations disappear, and then cities are once again allowed to require the owner to reside on site. For junior accessory dwelling units, JADUs, it is required that a city require the owner to live on site. This makes no sense, you say. Okay, I might agree with you. I also might think that arguably the way that I wrap my head around this is that I think to myself, I think the purpose of a JADU is for the prototypical example of grandma that wants to live on the same property as their kids. So the kids live in the single family dwelling, in other words, the owner, and the JADU is for grandma. Grandma only needs 500 square feet. The owner must live on site. So potentially you could have an ADU and a JADU and a single family dwelling all on one site. And then short-term rentals are prohibited for the JADU. Why do we remember it this way? Because it's for grandma. I'm making this up. There's no grandma rule. This is just how I remember it. All right, next slide. All right, common interest developments. In other words, condo associations. So if you have a common interest development, there is also similar rules that limit the ability of single family condo associations from stopping ADUs, which is different than apartment dwelling ADUs. So if you're in an apartment condo situation, that rule is not what we're talking about. We're talking about essentially the gated community. There they need to allow ADUs, and there are reasons, and they need to allow, they cannot prohibit unreasonable restrictions. They cannot establish unreasonable restrictions. So this is coming to a housing development near you. All right, next slide. Oh, and I believe I'd have, if you want to email me, I could get you the citation. I want to say it's Civil Code 7541 ? I will, if you really need that citation, I'll get you the exact link. Examples. So like I said, cities always have the ability to be more permissive than state law mandates. So here are some examples of situations where cities have decided to be more permissive than state law requires. For example, some cities allow new construction accessory dwelling units to be more than 2 stories. That is the case in Costa Mesa. Some cities have reduced the minimum size of bedrooms from 220 square feet to 150 square feet. Again, Costa Mesa. Some cities do not impose limits on the number of bedrooms in an ADU. That's most cities. But their HCD has said that cities do not have the authority to limit the number of bedrooms. But I completely disagree with that position. I've asked them their legal justification for it, and I find it lacking. They've told me their reasons, and I could go into explaining why, but my short version is, in my view, cities can do it. Most cities choose not to. Some cities choose to allow junior accessory dwelling units to be in attached garages, or even regular garages if we want to. A city could have the choice to allow 5 JADUs in a single family lot. I doubt they would ever do that, but they have the choice. They have the ability to do that. Cities can sometimes reduce development impact fees. They might not charge diffs for JADUs. Some cities will offer credits for affordability covenants because cities need to meet their regional housing needs assessment requirements. So in other words, cities have this mandate to make sure that you have enough affordable housing within their jurisdiction. So if you're willing to sign on the piece of paper that says, I pinky swear that for the next 55 years, this is going to be affordable to somebody of low or moderate income, then the city would give, that makes the city happy. But then that also provides, then the city might, in exchange for doing that, offer some sort of an incentive or a credit. And I think Willie's going to take it from here.
There you go. I think you can hear me. Oh, yes. Okay. Again, thank you, Scott. So the question now is, how does the state and local ADU laws translate into the built environment? In the next few slides, I'll be showing some examples of best practices and how some provisions have been implemented. But first, as a general rule of thumb, when assessing if a property is suitable for an ADU, 3 questions that I generally ask myself. One is the zone. Is it zoned for residential or mixed use, as Scott has mentioned? If so, then ADU is allowed. Then next would be the lot designation. Does the city designate the lot as a single family or multi-family dwelling lot? This will determine the type of ADU, the number of ADU, and the size of ADU that you can have on the lot. And last is the standards. Given the state's minimum standards, some cities may have, again, what Scott mentioned earlier, may have a more permissive standards such as height, balconies, and parking that will give you more creative freedom to design. When it comes to lot designation, this again will determine the type, the number, and the size of ADUs that's allowed. ADUs come in 3 general forms, which is a conversion, you have the attached, and you have the detached. Sorry. In most cases, within a single family dwelling lot, all 3 forms are allowed. However, in a multifamily dwelling lot, only conversions and detached ADUs are allowed, again, unless local jurisdiction allows for attached ADUs. Diving deeper into the lot. So as architects, one of the most important to ask or to take into account is the parameter in which you can design, the site envelope. State has, as Scott has mentioned, implemented the minimum threshold where you can build within the property. That is the 4-4-16 rule, as I call it, 4-foot side, 4-foot rear, and 16 feet in height. Within this envelope, you can be as creative as you want in terms of the form and size. Other cities may allow a 2nd floor or 2-story ADUs, but since, again, it is more permissive than state, there may be other rules that apply, such as requiring more setback on the 2nd floor ADU. Mentioned earlier, again, some cities may allow for a 2nd floor ADUs, others may prohibit due to potential view impacts, which is a major concern for a lot of neighbors. When a city does allow for a 2nd floor 2-story ADUs, our recommendation is to assess privacy and natural view impacts. The image to your right is a potential proposal wherein the ADU is incorporated above the garage with a balcony facing towards the front. This instills the concept of eyes on the street while mitigating direct views to the adjacent neighbor's yard. When an egress window is required per California building code, it can be located towards the interior of the lot. If more light is needed in the room, then a clear story window can be placed alongside of the property, again, to avoid privacy impact into the neighbor. In general, alley-loaded and corner lots are more suited for ADUs to, again, mitigate view impacts. Another concern that we receive is the perception of increase in density and garage conversions. A good proposal is to avoid competing residential entries. In order to retain the primary entry within the lot, ADU entries can be located on the side, rear, or interior of the lot. If the ADU is proposed on the second floor, an enclosed stair may be proposed. This, again, avoids potential second-story view impacts to the neighbors while walking up to the second floor ADU unit. So take the image to the top right as an example. The entry is located towards the rear of the property, and then the image to your lower right shows an enclosed and integrated stairway to the ADU. The most economically feasible way to have an ADU may be the conversion of a garage. However, this is where the question of form versus function comes into play for the architects. Take, for example, the image to your right. When the garage is converted, the space no longer functions as a garage, but a livable space. An idea is to provide a facade with articulation that blends with the architecture of the home. But once converted, another question we can ask is, do we have to remove the driveway? Some cities will allow you to keep the driveway to provide parking. However, to avoid the look of one large asphalt that doesn't function as a driveway, interlocking pavements or passing driveways are recommended. When it comes to the style of the architecture, some cities have implemented their discretionary design guidelines in a more objectionary standard within the ADU standards. So as shown to the upper right, when an attached ADU occurs, it is best to retain the architectural feature of the primary residence to blend the ADU to the primary architecture style of the residence. But when it is a detached ADU, you may have a different architectural style from the primary residence, but by retaining the mass and scale to match the primary residence, this will actually soften the two volumes on site. So regarding prefabs, there is this preconceived notion of what a prefab or modular home would look. Although some cities have taken a relaxed approach, these homes are better suited to be located at the rear of the property on a fixed foundation. Aside from the minimum room dimension per California building code, some cities have adopted 150 square feet threshold to allow for these tiny homes. So that concludes our presentation. If anyone has any questions, we are here to answer them.
Okay, I see a couple questions that have already been asked in the chat box. I'm going to answer those. And while I'm going there, if other people have additional questions, certainly feel free to click the chat button and chat away, and we'll answer what we can. So there's two, they look like legal questions, so I will jump in there. The first question is, do ADUs have to comply with city rear yard open space requirements, for example, 20% within 30 feet of rear property line in some areas? Okay, so number one is, well, the answer is, I'm a lawyer, so the answer is maybe. Okay, so the reason it's maybe is, number one, the first thing is always a city must allow the overrides. So if it is, let's say, a single family dwelling, if it If your ADU is less than 800 square feet, complies with side and rear setbacks of 4 feet, and is no greater than 16 feet in height, then the city would be required to allow it. Okay, but what if you're trying to do something more than that? You want it to be taller than that. You want it to be more than 800 square feet. You want it to be 1,000 square feet, for example. So in that instance, the only way to go above 800 square feet is to comply with the city's zoning requirements. So can the city require additional things? The answer is yes. So once you go above that threshold and you're no longer using one of the overrides, then the city is allowed to establish its own requirements, provided that they don't violate state law, presumably their municipal code. So I would just read their municipal code. Most likely their municipal code does not violate state law. That is, if their attorneys aren't playing games or they did a good job. So that's hopefully answers your question. I see a second question that says, I am creating a JADU, a junior ADU, in an existing space within an existing duplex. Oops, okay, hold on a second. Let me just stop right there. Within a duplex. No, it needs to be within an existing single family dwelling. So if it's a duplex, it's no longer a single family dwelling. But let's assume that we're now in a single family dwelling, okay? So if it's in a single family dwelling, and now the question is, do I have to provide a 1 hour fire rated separation between the new JADU and the house? I do know that you have to comply with state building code requirements. Willie or Minu, do you have to add any extra, do you know what state building requirements are there?
I believe that fire rating is not required, but Willie might know better than me.
And unfortunately, I don't have the code in front of me.
We're lawyers and planners. What do we know about building? Go ask the building official. They'll know. So that's a building official question. One thing that does make a JADU a little bit different than an ADU is that because it's in the same single family dwelling, remember, in my worldview, this is where grandma lives, okay? So the way to think about that is, interestingly, unlike an ADU is a separate dwelling. It's basically a mini apartment. It needs to have a bathroom, or it needs to have toilet facilities. It needs to have a kitchen. It could be an efficiency kitchen, that's fine. But it needs to have some sort of kitchen facilities. Whereas a JADU does not have to have its own restroom, bathroom facilities. Those can be shared with the primary dwelling. Not required to be shared, but they're allowed to be shared. Why would we do this? Because in my view, grandma's living there. You can share with grandma. Grandma's allowed to use the same bathroom, but you still need to have a separate entrance. Grandma still needs to have an efficiency kitchen at minimum. So there are those minimum requirements.
So I
right.
agree, Scott. I think because of the loose definition of a JADU as far as separation, that would be a hard thing to require. So my answer would be no, we wouldn't require it, but I'll probably have to talk to the building official.
Right. So I will point out that there are two separate statutes here. One is Government Code Section 65852.2, which is for ADUs, and then .22 is for JADUs. They're interrelated. I stated that you can have an efficiency kitchen for an ADU. I don't recall. Is that accurate? I would assume that it is, but I don't want to say things definitively if that's not correct. That's one of those things I can look up. All right. Willie, maybe you want to tackle this one. How do we address parking issues? Do you have suggestions on parking?
Yes, we also have Crystal Arroyo, but yes, let me go ahead and talk about parking issues.
Oh.
So I can speak on behalf of the City of Costa Mesa, and that, again, it depends on how we consider parking issues. With Costa Mesa, they were more liberal in the sense that they just eliminated parking requirements outright. But if one is concerned about parking, then in which case, don't convert the garage. So addressing the parking issue, that's more of a city council, planning commission.
So I will throw one bone here, and that is that state law expressly states that a city must allow, there are rare exceptions, but in general, a city is required to allow parking within the setback areas. So maybe you want to widen your driveway, that may be an option there. So Crystal had a question here. If the garage is attached to the single family residence, can that be converted to a JADU? So that is an interesting question. The answer is a JADU needs to be part of the single family dwelling. So in my view, the single family, so it needs to be part of the residence. And my interpretation, other lawyers will disagree with me. So, but my interpretation is that the city is not required to allow a JADU in a garage, because a garage, you cannot reside in a garage. So therefore it is not part of the residence. Yes, it's attached to the residence. A residence is where you can reside, whereas the garage is attached to the residence. Now, certainly arguments could be made to the contrary. You might say, oh, well, it's attached to the residence, it's part of a residence. People use it, you basically use it like you live in it, which is true. People quite often will have their gym and their whatever in their attached garage, but don't they also do that in their detached garage? So how is that any different? So the answer is it's not totally clear, but I gave you the legal standards. I don't recall offhand what, I believe HCD agrees with me. I'm not positive in that regard. You could see what HCD has to say. Can you convert a second floor into an ADU? So recall that, so the answer is probably yes. The answer, the reason I say probably yes is that you are allowed to convert an existing structure into an ADU. So the fact that it's an existing two-story structure and you can convert that to an ADU, you do need to have, it does need to have its own entrance. So you might have to convert, you might have to build an interior stairwell. State law allows you to add up to 150 square feet to accommodate access. So maybe that would be an external stairwell if the city allows that.
And Scott, I also wanted to add, we have to distinguish whether or not the property is single family or multifamily. So within a single family, if the city allows for a second floor ADU, then yes, you can convert the second floor livable area. But when it comes to multifamily, under state and in our city as well, it has to be non-livable space. So one cannot just convert another bedroom within a second floor in an apartment complex. It has to be non-livable space on the second floor that can be converted within a multifamily. So we're talking about gyms, we're talking about laundry rooms, those are non-livable spaces.
Correct. Second floor of the primary single family residence sounds like, oh, Crystal was just clarifying. All right, let's see. If we have an ADU with a deck for a roof, does that count towards the 800 square foot limit? That is a good question. The answer is probably. I would expect so. Every city is going to have their own calculations about how they calculate square feet. I would expect that it would, but if you have a deck for a roof, I don't know. How did they do it in Costa Mesa? Would that count towards your square footage?
It would not, but we wouldn't allow, if you're, I don't know if the question is related to a roof deck, any kind of roof deck, balcony, anything that's an extension of an open space is not allowed as part of an ADU because of privacy. Because these kind of structures tend to impose privacy issues to the neighboring properties. So the only way we approve like an exterior staircase is that when you land, you have a very limited space for the landing. So that's how we have interpreted it. So some other cities may allow it, but in Costa Mesa, you couldn't get away with that.
Okay, let's see. What are the rules for adding ADUs to an existing duplex? What are the differences to single family homes? All right, so this is a really complicated question. It sounds really straightforward, but it's really complicated. Remember what I said, that state law has set up special rules, different rules depending on whether it's a single family, whether you have a single family dwelling existing on the lot, or whether you have a multifamily dwelling existing on the lot, which is different from the zoning. Whether it's in the single family zone or a multifamily zone is a totally separate question. So remember that what is the definition of a multifamily structure? A multifamily structure is an apartment building. Okay, it is not two detached duplexes. If they're attached to each other, then it is a multifamily dwelling structure. And HCD agrees with me. It's not how I would have written the law. It's probably not how HCD would have written the law, but that's what the state law is. Now, some cities might be more permissive. They might actually say, well, you know, we're going to count duplexes the same regardless of whether they're attached or detached. A city can do that. But as far as what state law must do is it would treat those essentially, you're kind of in the Never Land. You would be able to get one ADU on the lot under the state overrides in that instance. You so remember, if you have a multifamily structure, you're allowed to get two detached ADUs. If it's a single family structure, you get one ADU. Well, it's not multifamily, so you get one. Now, again, some cities would allow you to have more, but you get one. All right, so it's 5:51. We're close to the end. Are there additional questions? If somebody wants to unmute, you can just ask your question directly, or I guess raise your hand, I think would be required. Either that or you can type into the chat box. Oh, all right.
Balram is raising hand. I don't have the capacity to unmute him.
Hi, hello.
So
Okay. I muted myself. Unmuted myself. Are you this far? Miro, thank you for this presentation, and Scott, and thank you very much. It's fantastic. It's good, but I think the parking is an issue that it hasn't been solved. So assuming that there's one single family has 4 cars, and then now we have the ADU with possibly another car, and we're taking the garage away, and it's a 50 feet frontage lot with 12, 15 feet of driveway. How are we dealing with the parking issue? We're going to have parking problems, I think.
That has been raised through many of our public hearings. I think the benefits of having these extra units kind of outweigh some of the parking and other impacts to the cities, and that's why, depending on what the city council decides, they can allow them so we can have more affordable units, more ADUs, and it's more of a local decision. And some cities still require, the city of Costa Mesa chose to waive the parking requirement. Some cities still require it, especially if you're not close to any kind of a public transit.
Council members are going to allow us to park in their houses when we don't have any parking space left to park. Where are we going to park? I mean, it doesn't really, to me, absolutely makes no sense what they're doing. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but it's just absolutely doesn't make sense when you don't have the parking, you allow this high density happening. And grandma's, I have a friend, she was like 90 something, she still drove. So don't expect the people over 90 that drive. It's an issue that has to be addressed sooner the better. So that's the old.
Yeah, you know, the point you bring up is a really good point, and that it's a common issue. I would say it's probably one of the biggest, I would say, complaints about ADUs is just exactly that, the parking issue, because 9 times out of 10, ADUs have little to no impact on the community. They're usually built in the backyard, or they might be a converted garage. And the only way that really impacts the neighbors is you might have more people on the lot, but usually doesn't impact the neighbors too much. If you've got fencing or landscaping or something, the fact that there's more people living on a lot usually doesn't have significant impacts, but parking is certainly one of the more substantial impacts. And the state, this is part of an ongoing state general push in the last number of years to be, for lack of a better word, care more about people than about cars. And I think that like we need somewhere to put, the state's view is we need somewhere to put people. So the fact that we don't have places to put cars, oh well, you know, that's just kind of the overall push. It's, if you get people, if you make parking more difficult, then people are more likely to walk. They'll take our alternate forms of transportation. This kind of fits in the whole anti-greenhouse gas initiatives. There are any number of things relating to that. I want to be aware of people's times. It's 5:55. We're slated to go up until 6 o'clock. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
There's one question about other states and do they allow us in the California thing?
This is definitely a national thing, especially I would say the coastal states, Oregon and Washington, they seem very in favor of ADUs. I can't speak too much about the East Coast, but I know that Oregon and Washington have been pushing the way because, well, and it's usually, in my experience, it's a product of density. The greater the density, the more demand there is for housing, the more expensive the land, the more desire there is to develop the land. So it's no surprise that the state legislators that were the biggest proponents of ADU legislation and are from the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and you know these areas that have had massive pushes for housing and the huge spike in housing prices. So I think it's definitely related to that. And the more rural you become, the less valuable land is and the less need you have for ADUs. So with that, what I will suggest is, last couple of comments from me is I did confirm it's Civil Code Section 4751 that relates to condominiums and the ability of, you know, we'll call them gated communities to regulate ADUs. And then Minu left a citation here in the notes. So you can link to HCD's article if you would like to see their booklet. Buyer beware, it's free. Not all of the advice in that I think is 100% accurate. I think it's mostly accurate, but HCD's goal is to increase the housing supply. And given that that is their view of the world, in all instances, not in all instances, but quite often, if they're choosing between two things, one will lead to more ADUs and one will not. Oh, well, then the law meant this. So, which isn't necessarily the way that I like to interpret the law. I like to interpret the law as being, it is what it is, how chips fall where they may. So that's HCD's view of the world, but it's certainly something that for most of us on this call, many of us are architects, that certainly would something that many of you could, would appreciate actually. So with that, I have no further comments.
Thank you so much for attending. I don't know if Jeff is still on the call, but we
Yes,
reached the 1 hour mark.
So I recall that you guys, to get credit, you need to email him, I believe. So you want to do that to get your AIA credit for attending.
Yeah, so what you want to do is email Marilee Edgar, and she put it in the chat. Most people already know who she is. You can definitely email me if you want to. I'll forward it over to Marilee. So I am going to let this just run. If anybody else has any questions, I know it's 5:59. It's up to the presenters and all of you when you want to end the meeting.
Looks like we have no more questions.
Sounds like it. So,
Thank you,
all right.
Scott.
Well,
Really.
yeah, well, yeah, glad to be part of it. I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you. It was excellent.
Have a great
Okay,
night.
everyone.
Bye.